Welcome to Forward Thinking, a Bison Roundtable. I'm Sharon Strange-Lewis, Director of Alumni Relations. Thank you for joining us today as we feed our souls with a conversation about things our grandmothers taught us. Both my paternal and maternal grandmothers passed away and joined the ancestors prior to my birth, so I didn't have the luxury of learning from them. But what I had was a great aunt and several elders in the community who poured things into me. And our ancestors, our elders, play such an important role in shaping us and our community. Dr. Sandra Crewe is our esteemed Dean of the School of Social Work, will navigate today's rich conversation with Dean Yolanda Pierce, Dean of our School of Divinity, and the author of the book, In My Grandmother's House. Dean Crewe's expertise in caring for families and our communities makes her the perfect person to navigate this heartwarming conversation. So now, Dean Crewe, let the roundtable begin.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm excited about this conversation we're going to have today, especially that it is during Black History Month, where we really do think about the contribution of our ancestors, and particularly the women who really have stood in the gap for us. And also it is National Red Dress Day, I believe, and where we are paying attention to heart health for women. And so this is a perfect opportunity for us to delve into this conversation with Dean Yolanda Pierce, my colleague from the School of Divinity. I am so excited. Good afternoon, Dean Pierce.
Good afternoon, Dean Crewe. It's just always an honor to be in your presence. You are one of my favorite people here at Howard, and I've just been looking forward to this conversation all week.
Well, thank you so much. So we're going to also kind of think about this as an intergenerational conversation because I am her senior. And so I am so excited to see the next generation at Howard in leadership. So thank you so much for this. Now, you know, Dean Pierce, as a scholar, we always critique each other's work. And I'd like you to know that there's an era in the title of your book. Okay. It should have been in our grandmother's houses.
Ours, all of ours.
Because all of us have those experiences as we think about the women in our lives who made a difference in our life. I was fortunate to have had the experiences of both of my grandmothers until my early adulthood. So I got some of that wisdom that you had that you were passed on as well. But as I think about today's time, let me start with today, if I might, and think about, is that wisdom still being passed along?
So that's an excellent question. And I think that's really at the heart of why this is about my grandmother. I'm a womanist theologian by training. So that's my background as a scholar. And one of the things that I really wanted to lift up was a subset of womanist theology that I'm calling grandmother theology. It's not about biological grandmothers, although those are, obviously some of the people we're talking about today, but it is about this generational wisdom. In the denomination in which I grew up, we had church mothers. We had a mother's board, and these were older women who basically, to be perfectly honest with you, they ran the church. And so I grew up with this understanding that there were powerful, faithful older women who were and had certainly permission to train me, to teach me, to discipline me, but who also loved me. And so part of my question has to do in this book is, where are we with that generation today? Where are these models of generational wisdom? What are the stories that are not being inherited and not being passed on? Because we're really there's something about this tradition that's really fading away. And so I wanted to really pay homage to it, because it would be such a loss if we don't, in fact, sort of keep alive the generational legacy of passing down our stories and our faith.
Thank you so much for that. As I was thinking, I shared with you earlier my experiences with church, as I grew up in rural America. And so not only was I fascinated by what you have written, because my experiences in rural America were very much aligned with yours in an urban center.
Yes.
in New York. So it says that something is passing along. And, Isabel Wilkerson has talked about, the Great Migration, but how these traditions followed as well, as we're thinking about it. And I said, Mom, now here she is in Brooklyn, and I'm in Halifax County, Virginia, and some of the same themes were present. So when I read your book, I was having that moment, and I really am going to have you talk a little bit more about grandmother theology, because sometimes I feel like it's akin to old school theology.
Well, it is that. Well, Dean Crewe, I love that. I love that you were reading and sharing, and that we have these experiences in common. So when I'm describing my grandmother and these church mothers, I am talking in part about that Black Great Migration, those first and second waves that brought Black folks from the South, from rural places, to New York, to Chicago, to Detroit, to Philadelphia, to Washington, D.C. And so it really does reveal to us that we are really sharing the same experiences, because we come from the same place as people of African descent, as descendants of slavery. So grandmother and grandmother theology, let me say, so womanist theology is a field, an academic field that was started in the 1960s. What essentially had happened was that feminist theology was being born as more women were entering the academy, but the feminist theology was being written by and about white women. You then had the introduction of Black theology with figures like Cone and Cleage, who were writing tremendous liberatory theology about Black folks, but being written primarily for and by Black men. And so womanist theology entered the academy as Black women got PhDs in these fields in larger number. And so at the center of womanist theology is the question of, how do women believe, move, live, and have their being in their faith traditions? And then how do they pass on those stories and that legacy? And so it is about old school wisdom. It is about the stories that we pass on and the stories that we share. It's also about, for me, a profound critique of how we think about leadership. And so I came from a tradition in which women were not even ordained to preach. And there are still many places in Black church traditions in which women cannot pastor, but these women were still leaders. And so it's Black History Month, and I'm thinking about how Black women's leadership manifests itself. You don't have to be the pastor to be powerful, right? And that's what they taught me. They just moved in these ways where I saw their power and their agency, even though they weren't the quote unquote people in charge. And that's really our story. I think about the women of the Civil Rights Movement, how they were able to move even though they weren't necessarily the presidents of the organizations, right? Or even the person on the mic, but they moved with power and with grace. So that old school wisdom, the power, the grace, but also real sense of leadership, taking ownership here, in particular, the theological tradition.
That's so important as I'm thinking about my upbringing, and I know those in the audience are having the same thoughts. And you mentioned this in your book. The real individuals who made sure that you were compliant with the rules and the regulations were often the women in the church. I never remember the deacons nor the pastor during my time commenting on my dress, on my behavior.
Right.
That was the work of the women in the front of the church who had those eyes in the back of their heads. I don't know how that would. I think when we think of Black women, we have to think about this extra sense they have. There, you know, we talk about the 5 senses, but I think there's a 6th one, and that is we are responsible for the next generation. And they carry that with them. And you kind of spoke about that. And I thought, that is so true. The comments were from my aunts, my mom, that's not the way you dress when you go to church. You know, they were the regulators.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is when I was in the beginning stages of writing the book, and I was talking to my editor, and she said, "What is the book about?" And I said, "It is the simple question I asked myself as a theologian." And the question was this, Dean Crewe: what if the greatest theologian that I've ever known is my grandmother? Because when I looked back over my formal education in the academy and doing a PhD, that was one thing. But where I actually learned faith, that was from my grandmother. That was from women in my church. My grandmother taught me how to pray. This might be other people's experiences on my tiny little twin bed when I was 5 or 6 years old, and she would kneel down with me, and she taught me how to pray. And women in the church who taught me a deep spirituality and my tradition, where we practice foot washing, in which we practice anointing with oil. The women were present. And I recognize now, in a way that I did not then, is that they were teaching me theology. They were teaching me about salvation, soteriology, and the life of the church, which is ecclesiology, and about what happens at the end of our lives, eschatology. They were teaching me by example the theological tenets of my church. And so that's a really powerful model for us to think about how, in fact, women teach. We teach with our words, but we also teach by ways of doing and being. And so that's why food is at the heart of the story, some of the essays in the book, because I learned in the kitchen. I learned how to cook by cooking. I learned how to cook by, standing there next to a master cook. And as she taught me, that's how you learn. And so how are we thinking about how women teach is even a profound piece of this for me.
Absolutely. As I, think about my upbringing and cooking, my job was to wash the jars for canning.
Oh, yes, the mason jars.
Yes, canning day. And so
Yes.
you were learning the processes involved in having the food needed for the winter months. And that's the wisdom of women. So they would gather as a group of women, but theology was going on at the same time.
Yes.
So I thank you so much for bringing us to the light that these were not just idle moments or work of busyness.
Right.
I kind of want to pull the idol back, because that generation didn't believe in idol. they really believed that, that
right.
idol.
You get busy, you clean something, find something to do.
Something to do. So it is. But again, that was teaching us work ethic. So we may have seen it as they're not giving us a moment to think or do anything, but it really was the work ethic that they were saying. But come Sunday, or come Wednesday night, there was a time to be on your knees to celebrate the gifts. But also, you point out in your book, it was also an opportunity for them to acknowledge their vulnerabilities and to ask for help from the higher being. And as your grandmother, as I read in your book, asked for help for her in rearing you.
That's exactly right. This question for me about vulnerability is an important one, because in chapter 7, I write an essay about a theological question. We call it theodicy. And I pose the question, does God love Black women? Right. And so this is a theodicy question, but I put it so starkly and so frankly because I wanted to talk about vulnerability. I wanted to talk about these women from the rural South, the descendants, like I said, of enslaved people and sharecroppers who were trying to make a way out of no way, who endured poverty. Until the middle of the 20th century, 85% of African-American women were domestic workers, right? This is our history, right? And so I'm thinking about their vulnerability. I'm thinking about all that they endured, things that they could not even share. things that they could not tell, things that they witnessed, things that happened against their very bodies and their very beings. And so this space of church, this prayer meeting, this tarry service provided them with a space to lay it at the altar, because in reality, for many of them, there were no other places where they could go with their sorrows. And so this question of God and loving Black women and theodicy and where is God when there's hurt and suffering is really to say Black women's agency is also about being vulnerable, given the realities of the socioeconomic situations that we face. And what I think is important then is that we recognize the importance of tenderness, right? And so how we can tenderly be with one another. And Dean Crewe, I'm thinking about that for those folks who are listening as we are talking. Howard University is having a mental health day because of many things that are happening on our campus. But how do we treat each other tenderly when the world is so fraught with pain and violence and all kinds of systems and forces and powers and principalities? So thank you for pointing to that, like Black women finding a place to be vulnerable with their pain, because there are very few places where Black women can be vulnerable. We always have to be strong. We're always perceived of that we have to be strong. Where do we go, if not in our faith traditions, to just lay our burdens down?
So Dean Pierce, it really kind of speaks to historical trauma and how we use that trauma, trauma to body, trauma to our mental well-being,
Yes.
to really prepare the next generation to address it. And that's really tough because sometimes the next generation isn't ready to receive the message. But you talked about how your grandmother transmitted it to you, and it's sort of like it was in an incubator.
Yeah.
So when it was ready to come out, it did come out.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was very, seems to me, very focused on not you as the child, but you as the adult. How would you carry forth the message and thinking about that?
That's so powerful. Dean Crewe, you just gave me a whole other thing. I'm just sitting here like, whoa, you just blew, because me, the adult. Wow.
Yeah, she had that in her, she had that in her prayer. I want her to be the adult who can weather these vulnerabilities. She has to be ready to do that. So in social work, we talk about biopsychosocial spiritual. You cannot work with someone unless you're connected to whatever their spiritual beliefs are. And your grandmother was the essence of this. If I go right ahead.
No, ma'am. I was just thinking, like, you just really gave me something that, like I said, I'm just sitting here like, wow, how powerful that was, because that's exactly it. It wasn't the focus on the child, but the adult that the child would become. I talk about how in our house, we didn't have images of white Jesus. So all of my life, some of you may be familiar with these pictures of Black Jesus, Jesus with the brown skin, Jesus sometimes with the locks, or Jesus with the curly hair. And this is what was up in my home. Like we had, picture of Martin Luther King, and we had picture of Black Jesus. And so that was all that I knew. And I had given an Easter speech as a little girl. And the prize for the Easter speech was a coloring book. And on the coloring book was a picture of white Jesus holding a little lamb. I never saw that coloring book again. I got it. It didn't even make it home. I now know what my grandparents were doing for the adult me was to say, you are made in the image and likeness of God. And so we're going to surround you by images of the divine that look like you, that have brown skin like you, that has hair like you. I did not have to unlearn what so many Black Christians have to unlearn, which is a white supremacy Christianity. I didn't have to unlearn it because I was never taught it. They were thinking, just as you said, about the adult me, not the kid who just didn't think anything about these pictures in our house, King, Jesus, is just all some pictures on the wall, but the adult me who has always had a vision. of a God who looks like me, and so a God who loves me. And when I look in the faces of the Black men in my life and my students and all of them that I love, I see the image of God. And so you just gave me something very powerful to think about, preparing children for the adults that they will become, and not just rearing them as the children that they are.
Well, as I read the book, and I really did focus on your exposure was to a Black Jesus, and your ponder as to how that happened, given that your grandparents migrated from the South, and that was not likely their particular experience. But I don't know that. I don't want to make that assumption because I don't know. But if it were your grandmother and my grandmother are in the same, and my mother, your grandmother and my mother were in the same generation. So let me just, contextualize it that way. And in my church, absolutely, there was this picture of a white Jesus, but somehow it was not in my home.
Right.
And so we're able to somehow compartmentalize those who didn't have that experience of the photographic image of a Black Jesus. But we were somehow able to find that center elsewhere. And so I think that speaks to how we are in and out of different cultures. I'm thinking of my colleague, Dr. Edwards, who writes about cultural intelligence. And so there's an aspect of cultural intelligence where your grandmother was saying, you need to own your own culture and be intelligent about from whence you come and where you're going. But there were also Black families able to do that, even with the images. Yes. And that's research we need to think about. How did we compartmentalize? And while others were dominated by that, others realized, well, that's just a part of segregation in society and people trying to impose their images on us. But I paid particular attention to the fact that your grandparents had Malcolm X.
Yes.
Particularly attention to that, because in rural America, who we would more likely would see Martin Luther King, and they had Martin Luther King too, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But we might also see the Kennedy family and rural America during my generation. Yeah. So, who people celebrated has a lot to do with how they move forward with their epistemologies.
This is critical, and it is about epistemology. I think about how influential it is, the images, the iconography that we see, and particularly that we grow up with. It impacts our sense of beauty, our sense of culture, our sense of what we perceive to be important, right? And those dominant messages that come from the outside world into Black households, into Black churches, and even Black schools, right? Are messages in which we are constantly in conversation. And so I know lots of Black churches, even to this day, where the stained glass windows are of a white Jesus, or where there's like a large picture in the pulpit or maybe above the baptismal pool of a white Jesus. And so I'm thinking about the contrast of that experience versus the experience, their lived experience of who they understand themselves to be as people of faith, and how we're constantly navigating that as Black folks, right? The images that we see, the iconography, the stereotypes being told about us, but without truths. And I wanted to have space for Black women's truths, especially about faith and religion, to live, to sometimes be critical, because one of the things I suggest is that there's some traditions that we have to leave behind, even as there are some things that we have to take with us, but to make space for the truths of their experiences. The Kennedy family, I never thought about that. I never saw an image of the Kennedy family, but this might be an urban thing where I saw it Malcolm X and of course King. And so I'm just thinking that's really powerful.
As we began to kind of, process that, but I know that if you didn't keep that photograph of the Black Jesus you wish you had.
Yeah.
And I would say that is so important. Sometimes we don't value things at earlier stages in our lives. But as we look at our elders who transition, it's important to be very deliberate and not get rid of some things that you don't necessarily see the value, because the acknowledgement of the value may be 20 years from now. And so be thoughtful about it. But I was thinking about, wonder if she still has that photograph of Jesus not ready to fight the good fight,
Right.
not the gentle Jesus.
Right. And it was not, because it was a picture. Jesus was not happy. It didn't, but he was brown, and he looked like folks that I knew. And like, you know, later on in life, I would run into somebody. I one year had a student, and I'm telling you, that student looked just like that image of Black Jesus. And I even kind of, you know, I was like, hey, how you doing? Just trying to get to know him, because I was like, wait a minute, this might be something in here happening. And so Dean Crewe, I don't have that painting from my home. And that's just really powerful, that what you said, which is, I couldn't have appreciated it then. I can think about how much it means to me now. And as you are someone I know who works with populations, older populations, thinking about what physical, tangible items do we sometimes need to hold on to, even if we don't recognize. I have my grandmother's Bible. And I think for me, if there was anything that epitomized who she was, it's that. And I cherish that above all things. But what are those actual material objects? That's a beautiful thought. I wish I had that picture of Black Jesus.
Yeah, but you're holding it in your heart. And
Definitely.
some of the things we have to hold in our hearts. But as I was thinking about what you had written, in the School of Social Work, we are working with grandmothers raising grandchildren, grandparents raising grandchildren. And they have a struggle, you know, skip generation patterns. And so you already have a divide between the other children's parents, maybe in one generation, and you're the grandparents or another generation. And these children are integrated into the school system with everyone else. Did you experience a difference when you were in school, when there was a PTA meeting or some other kind of meeting where there were younger parents and then there was your grandparent?
Yes, I mean, so the difference is that my grandparents were not interested in those things at all, right? Like, and so really, in some respects, left education to me. Like, did not. It's when we were talking a little bit earlier before we came on camera, being raised by grandparents, they didn't believe that children should ever be bored or have nothing to do. So I don't remember much leisure in my childhood. Like, if I was not doing something, there was something to clean, there was something to cook, there was something to take care of. And so I think about their ethos of raising children, right? And now as a parent, it's like so vastly different than my own. But one of the things that struck me as you were asking the question is, what things did they leave for me to navigate, and what things did they feel were important for them to be the primary caretakers of? My education, I left at 16 to go to college. All of that really was about what was happening in the school system for me. What was critical, though, for them, of course, was me growing in the faith, my education in the faith, and they weren't going to leave that to anyone else. And so they were very protective about what I was being taught about God and about scripture. They were very insistent upon that. And so I'm thinking about the question of generational divides. Here's the best way to answer this. 16, I was getting ready to go to college at tarry service at our church. We would tarry from 7, 8 p.m. all night long. It was going to be my final tarry service because I was leaving for college the next day. And so grateful, because you're 16 and you want to get out of the house. You just want to leave, right? And the church mothers, unbeknownst to me, had prepared to wash my feet and anoint me before I went to college. you're 16 years old. You don't want to touch feet. You don't want to talk about feet. You don't want anybody touching your feet. Like, this was like just so the most terrible thing to me. But with the wisdom of my age now, I think about how sacred that moment was, that what they were doing was saying, we are trying to create a hedge of protection and love around you before we send you into a world that we cannot control, a world that might not love you the way that I've loved you. And so I'm thinking about, there are lots of gaps between generations. I didn't understand what they were doing. I certainly didn't want it to be done, because you just want to, you're 16, you want to go to the movies, you want to do your thing, you want to just get away from home. But how do we, in fact, fill in those gaps of understanding so that it's not too late? Right. And that's really where I'm concerned. I don't want that understanding to come too late. I don't want that understanding to come after the person has passed. How do we fill in those gaps? And so it's really profound, as I know we've talked about this before, as you all are training folks who are working with grandparents raising grandchildren. How do we deal with that gap and fill it with the kind of love and care and tenderness that can transcend whatever misunderstandings there could possibly be?
And particularly when some of the children are placed with their grandparents because of trauma,
right.
Adverse childhood experiences. Right. And that sort of adds another layer there, that as scholars and practitioners, that we have to be mindful of how we are helping the children to navigate, because all of them have not had the powerful experience that you've had, and thinking about that. Mm-hmm. So if I might, if I may segue into something in your book that struck me particularly, was the courage you showed as a young faculty member when a young Black male student was being arrested. Talk to me about that moment in your career.
You look back, Dean Crewe, I know you've been in the academy a long time, and now it's been a long time now for me, and you think back of just pivotal moments that have made you the professor, the scholar, now the dean that you are. This was one of them. I was maybe 2-3 years post PhD, a new assistant professor teaching at a predominantly white institution, a large state institution, and very few African-American students at the school, and even fewer, so the ones in my class, I knew them. I knew them. I knew their names. I knew their stories. Police officers came to my classroom, and they had a warrant for the arrest of one of my students. And I have to tell you that this was a very scary moment for me, because I don't want to make it sound like I was some icon of courage. This was scary to me. Black people have a history with law enforcement. And so I'm in the classroom. There are police officers standing outside my classroom. They want to talk to me. They have a warrant for arrest. I'm just thinking about all the ways this could possibly go wrong. And I'm at the center of it. And you are taught as a Black person, you keep yourself out of jail, out of trouble. And so I'm scared. But I also knew the young boy that they were looking for. And I made a decision that I was not going to allow them to come into my classroom and handcuff him and take him. I didn't want his experience as a minority, one of very few at this large white institution, to be here are the police coming to arrest this young Black man. I said to the police officers, I said, I'm teaching this class. Class is 50 minutes long. You can wait outside. And then when my class is over, I'll allow you to come into the classroom. And I went in the class and I closed the door. One of my PhD students, one of my doctoral students, an African-American man who now teaches at the University of Memphis, he physically stood as my deacon for defense at that door. And I taught a class. I don't even remember. I was like, what? I taught a class? I don't know. So taught the class ends. I let all of the students go. I talked to that young man and I say to him, there's a police officer outside waiting. This was for me about how we are often subject to moments of humiliation and shame. And I didn't want that to happen to him. I wish I had more words to have given to him, but I didn't want that humiliation and shame, whatever was going to happen. I just didn't want that. So the other students left. The police eventually did come. They came physically into the classroom and they arrested him. I could not find the student after this. He never returned back to university. Never returned certainly back to my class. And the story really haunts me, but it taught me some things as an educator. And as we are educators, even though we're deans, I know you and I both love the classroom and we love being educators. It taught me something powerful about being an educator. It taught me about, I had a courage I didn't know that I had. It taught me that I needed my classroom to be a space where no one was ever going to be shamed. No one was ever going to be humiliated. No one was ever going to be made to feel less than, right? We're all in different places on our journey, but I don't ever want a student of mine to feel less than something. It taught me some lessons as an educator that I still hold with me to this day, but it also still haunts me that I don't know what happened to this young man. He may have been 18, 19 years old, and the interruption to his life, heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
It was heartbreaking.
And, you know, I reflected upon the book on Westmore when I was reading that passage, when there are two Westmores, one living in the same neighborhoods, basically, but one is able to move forward in a positive way, and the other one is incarcerated. But we don't know the outcome of that young man. But what I was thinking is that he's holding that moment wherever he is that somebody cared enough for me to intercede. So I think, and then I was thinking, there was that Black Jesus.
There's that Black Jesus again.
Yeah, there was that Black Jesus looking troubled. And
Absolutely.
he was influencing your thinking and how you handle this, because I almost know you didn't get any training for that.
No,
in preparation, you know, to become a faculty member. There was no script for that. So the script came through your grandmothers introducing you to that Black Jesus who was troubled.
Troubled by exactly that. Oh, I love that. There is no script. There is no script in a PhD program for what you do when the police show up right at your door. There's no script for a lot of what we actually do as an educator. But it is, in fact, my grandmother, my grandparents, and these church mothers, their teaching, which was that God gives us so much grace, so much grace, unmerited grace. And I don't know where this young man is. And I do hope what you're saying is true, that if he can look back and there's a moment in which someone tried to spare him from a certain kind of shame and humiliation and just wanted to love on him, and they wouldn't let me go, because then of course I was like, can I go? You know, and they're like, you can't go, we're arresting him. You know, and they put him in the police car. At this point, my department chair is there. It's a whole big deal. But it was, for me, the teachings of that Black Jesus, the teachings of the church mothers, which is, how do we love people out loud? How do we love people in real time? Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public. So love isn't a feeling, love is an action. So for those people who believe in an ethos of Christian love, how does that show up with how we treat people and how we move through the world? And so that story, a really, really powerful story for me.
Well, you know, I was thinking of Naomi Tutu, the daughter of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, said to me that Black women don't always get a thank you. And so I say to you, on behalf of that young man, thank you.
No.
Thank you.
No.
Because it made a difference, and I know that it made a difference. So as Black women, we have to remember the importance of saying thank you, which really addresses another chapter in your book about gratitude. You know, how do we say thank you? How do we show appreciation for those who really have stood in the gap? I often say, I don't celebrate first, because it often means that someone else was denied the opportunity to be the first. And we, those of us who are differentiated because of that, it's because the door was blocked for someone else. We weren't any brighter, we weren't any smarter, but that other person paved the way, but never was able to cross the barrier. And so those are the people in our lives that we have to think about and give gratitude to. So let me hear your take on, you have a definition of gratitude that's quite powerful in the book.
So it's, I've been thinking a lot about gratitude, I was thinking of the scriptural reference in which Jesus performs a miracle for 10 people, and 9 people just leave, but only 1 returns back to say thank you. And this is a really powerful parable. And so questions of being thankful, how do you express that gratitude, and where does it show up in moments big and small? And so I recall, for me, both as a child, but now also as someone who speaks and teaches and preaches, and I'm in churches a lot, the experiences of being in these churches and how thankful I am for their existence. This isn't addressing my book, but just something larger. I think about the history of the Black church. The Black church was formed as a protest. It was a protest movement. African Americans were worshiping at white churches. There were some courageous men who kneeled at the altar of a white church, and they were physically removed from their knees while they were praying. And eventually they go on to found the first African American denomination. I say that to say that I have such a depth of gratitude toward the formation of the Black church, the ways in which the Black church created not only spaces for worship, but created schools. This is Howard's story. It was founded by congregational ministers. This is Spelman's story, the Morehouse's story, our HBCU story, how some of these churches were the first land that African Americans could own. We know from records that we have that African Americans were able to have deeds to land to build churches even before they could own themselves, could own their own bodies, right? They had this space. And so in part, telling this history is me to think about how profoundly grateful I am for the field in which I study and connected to is built upon generations of sacrifice and love and care. And so my gratitude isn't just, oh, I was raised by grandparents and they were wonderful. They were wonderful and strict and hard and all of the things that they could be. But in fact, I am a part of a tradition, and that tradition has saved me, and that tradition has loved me and helped to educate me and has sent me forward. And so expressing my gratitude every chance I get for that is important to me. But I think gratitude is a practice. It is something that we should do. It should be a spiritual discipline, like fasting or prayer. There's a gratitude, a posture, literally, of gratitude. And I think it's so critical for us to practice it. We've got to give each other a little more grace and a lot more thanks. So thank you, Dean Crewe, because you are an amazing colleague. And not just having this conversation with you reminds me to thank you for being such a wonderful colleague and a mentor to the baby deans who joined a couple of years ago.
Well, you know, I knew I moved into that category when you all started calling me ma'am. I said, and I accepted and I own it. Such a wonderful group of young colleagues that I have the experience to work with. But I'm going to read for the audience what you say about gratitude, because I think it was so powerful and so meaningful. Gratitude requires returning to that moment of need, even after the need has been met. Powerful. because often we'll give the quick thank you, in the moment thank you. But when you delve into gratitude, you basically say it's more than in the moment. It's in the spirit.
Yes.
That I'm going to call that person's name for different generations and remind them that someone sowed something into me. And that's what In My Grandmother's House does. It shows that I have gratitude for those who poured something into me. Even if I didn't always agree with what some of those things were, it doesn't diminish the gratitude for giving you the ability to critically think and make decisions. So I think that is so important. And as we, as academicians, move forward and impart with our students, it is important that they understand gratitude, because none of us, not one of us, arrived where we are today without someone sacrificing. When we think about the history of HBCUs, it was the Freedmen's Bureau, but not just the Freedmen's Bureaus. African Americans raised money to really support schools. They didn't just rely upon a governmental entity to do it. They used their own funds to support education for Black people. That's where we owe gratitude.
Absolutely.
So I thank you so much for elevating that in your book and reminding us that Black History Month is an opportunity that we show gratitude. But during my upbringing, colleagues, we had Negro History Week. And I say that because often people will say nothing has changed. Things have changed. We have grown by the changes in civil rights. Are we where we need to be? Absolutely not. I had the opportunity to talk with Miss Gwen Carr the other night and dealing with her son's death, who has become an icon, you know, for the mothers movement. When we're thinking about mothers who've lost their children as a result of the carceral violence that's out there, we owe them a debt of gratitude for their ultimate sacrifice. So I think in the Black community, we can never neglect paying attention. You think about Hidden Figures, right? Those women, for years, nobody knew about them. So that is the responsibility for the next generation of scholars to unearth some of the heroes and the sheroes that are out there. You did that in your book. And I love that style where you would really stop and say, well, let me go back and tell you the influential people. So tell me some of the women you mentioned in the book.
So I called some of them by name, and then some of them are just kind of types that I think we would all recognize. I had a Mother Johnson in my life, and Mother Johnson, she was the mean church mother. I had Miss Priscilla, who was a neighbor, and you know, she looked after all of us as if we were her own children and her own grandchildren. These were, by every measure people would measure, these were very ordinary women. Neither of my grandparents were educated. Neither of them had even finished high school. We grew up.
Hold it! I have to stop you there. I can't let you say, oh, they were educated.
They were not formally educated in academic institutions. And you're right to stop me there, because that's exactly the point. That how did this community of poor folk, this is just poor folk, who hadn't received, quote unquote, a formal education, that somehow constantly made a way out of no way. And so I call a list of names that I heard growing up. Names I sort of, I laugh at because literally, it was in Washington, D.C. that this happened to me. I heard a young mother call her daughter. She said, Hattie, Hattie, come here. And Hattie had blonde curls and blue eyes. And I'm like, Hattie, I knew a Miss Hattie. I knew a Miss Hattie and a Miss Ernestine and a Miss Priscilla and a Mother Johnson. I knew a Miss Beulah. Like, these were names of, for me, you know, church mothers and grandmothers and aunties, right? And now they're the names of little tiny blonde hair, blue-eyed white toddlers. And I'm like, wow, these generational names. But I call their names, you know, the Johnny Mays and the Francis and the to celebrate that we come from this wonderful heritage. Many of us, you know, a Southern heritage and then maybe that moved north, or Southern heritage that stayed in the South. But it was important simply for me to just say some of the names of these women who helped to raise me and who helped to educate me, and that we all have that list. Again, it's not about biological, but we all have that list.
We have them. I know when Miss Gertie told me to do this. I remember, you know, Miss Lily Mae, and they were all a part of my aunts and all, but calling their names as I mentioned Mrs. Carr. She is the mother of Eric Garner. And so she talked about the importance of hearing her son's name called, but her name is equally important to call, because mothers of those who were lost, like Emmett Till's mother, Miss Mamie Till, we are responsible for calling their names. Now, I really had to think a lot about the lesson you taught about your grandmother's funeral, Miss Vivian. Names are important. And when the eulogist failed to call her by her correct name, it really did something to the service and the celebration of your mother when he did not call her by her correct name. Yeah. She was Vivian, not Virginia.
Not Virginia.
Vivian, not Virginia.
Yes. You know, it was a decision, thinking again, as a theologian, to end the book on what is a fairly somber note, which is the death of my grandmother and her funeral. Because one of the fields in which I work is eschatology, which is the end times. What happens after we die? What do we believe about heaven or hell or life after death? And when you are working with and living with and worshiping with older folks, as I was being raised by them, questions about death came up a lot. So I wasn't afraid of death. But this experience of someone not calling my grandmother by her right name really it has shaped me in ways big and small. It was the trauma of it and the pain and the hurt of it, but it also made me resolute about, one, like really actually calling people by their proper names, like asking my students, like, what name would you like me to call you? Like, it is a real thing. We should respect people's names, pronouns, because that's a very, very real thing. But it also is about how we do the work historically. And so I ground my historical work in the experiences of Black women by naming them. And spelling their names correctly and saying their names correctly, that we bless our origins. You know, in our community, we love honorifics, right? So for me, I grew up with honorifics. Someone was a miss or a sister or a mother or Mr. or uncle, or so you had something. If you were a child, you didn't call grown folks by their first name. And naming and honorifics are still very, very important to me, because I need the people on the other side to know that what I'm saying is out of respect for who they are, for what they do, for what they bring. It isn't that I couldn't call you something other than Dean Crewe, but I so deeply respect your generational transformation of training women leaders in higher education. So names are important, honorifics are important. I wanted that minister to say her name, and he did not. And so it made me resolute to be very clear about how I name people in my own work, how I name people when I encounter them, and how I hold on to traditions of what names mean for us. In a world in which our grandmothers and forebears and ancestors were called boy, right? Where we're called some name, somebody made up, Sue or Polly, and that wasn't their name, disrespected, literally called out of their name, then I have to make sure that I am always respectfully naming, because that is a part of homage and reverence.
And that's so important as, you know, we prepare the next generation. In social work, often you will encounter a client, and they'll be an older client, and they'll just say, call me by my first name. I said, that is not a permission that we accept. You may give me that permission. I've said to you, Yolanda, call me Sandra. You don't accept that permission because it's something culturally sometimes that really gets in the way of that. And so I would say, even if given permission, be very careful about accepting the permission that people offer you in doing that. So it's, we do in the Black community value those honorifics. And it is not better than or lesser than. It is a part of our culture where our names were not valued.
Absolutely.
And so we don't shorten them. And when we're dealing with, when we are meeting our international students where they are, we try to invest in pronouncing their names.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it's difficult, but we have to invest in it, because that is the name that their ancestors gave to them. And that may be somebody's grandmother's name.
That's right.
And that grandmother never thought that they would have someone at Howard University. So it's worth us investing in their names, even if they give us permission to call them a shortened name. So your story about Miss Vivian really resonated with me, is that names matter, because that name represented more than a name on a program.
Absolutely.
The name is a person. And so thank you for sort of highlighting that.
Thank you.
And so I'm reminded, I struggle sometimes, but I said, I'm going to struggle with you. Struggle with me until I get your name right, because it matters.
It does matter.
When I'm thinking about Black History Month, and I'm particularly a student of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is truly my hero. And you speak about in the book where prayer was an avenue where people would not let go.
I think, Dean Crewe, did you freeze on me? There you go.
Okay. So I was thinking about Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman is someone that I really write about, and I appreciate her. But in your book, you were writing about prayer, where individuals would pray until they got an answer. Pray until they got an answer. And one of the things Harriet Tubman talked about doing the Underground Railroad, she would go to one of the supporters and say that the Lord sent me here to get funds from you for me to continue my journey. And they would say, but the Lord didn't tell me that. And she would say, well, I'm going to sit here and pray with you until the Lord gives you the message. So that's the persistence that you talk about with prayer, because it's not a one and done. When you describe your grandmother's daily rituals. So talk to me about prayer.
Absolutely. I know this has to be the last question I answer, because I know our time is short. I'm laughing because, Dean Crewe, maybe we need to go sit with some of our funders and say, we are going to sit here because God has told us to stay and pray, because that might be a development strategy we have to pursue. I am where I am today because my grandmother prayed for me, because she taught me the power of prayer. She taught me intercession, to pray for others, to stand in the gap for others. But as you suggested about Harriet Tubman, she taught me to pray with my feet, which is to say that you can pray, you still have to work. You still have to do the task at hand. And there are many of us, I certainly think about our wonderful students at Howard, many of them, their journeys to Howard only possible because somebody prayed for them. Someone made it happen. Someone persisted and tarried. And that's what we have to do. That's what the faith requires of us. We pray with our feet, we pray and we work, but we pray until something happens. I love the model of Harriet Tubman, and that might be my fundraising model for the next academic year.
Thank you so very much,
Thank
Dean
you.
Pierce. I have enjoyed the conversation, and I think we end with that powerful message. Your
Thank you.
grandmother prayed for you, and now you have the responsibility for praying for others. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so very much, Dean Crewe. Thank you, everyone who's in the audience, and thank the development team for hosting us. And always a shout out to the HU alum who are a part of this conversation. I hope everyone has a wonderful Black History Month.